Okay, picture this. Have you ever had just a genuinely brilliant, paradigm-shifting idea? Something you absolutely knew could change the game, only to have it instantly shot down by the quote-unquote experts? Or, maybe you've watched a coworker pitch a wildly innovative solution and management just immediately dismisses it because, well, that's just not how we do things around here. If you're nodding your head right now, trust me, you are far from alone. Today, we're exploring the really fascinating and honestly sometimes incredibly frustrating reasons why the world so consistently rejects its absolute best ideas.
Welcome to today's Explainer, the Anatomy of Rejection. Why exactly does society silence its visionaries? Let's dive right into this. Because what we're diagnosing today, it isn't just a streak of bad luck for a couple of misunderstood geniuses. No, we are looking at a deeply entrenched systemic, psychological, and sociological condition. We're going to figure out exactly why human beings and the massive institutions we build seem practically hardwired to crush the exact innovations we desperately need to survive.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to kick things off with the price of vision, then unpack the Semmelweis Reflex, explore tall poppy syndrome, and examine institutional gatekeeping. After that, we'll zoom out to look at societies in decline, and finally, talk about breaking the cycle.
All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, the price of vision and history's martyr scientists.
To really understand how we reject visionaries today, we've got to look back at the historical extremes. History shows us a pretty dark, centuries-old tradition of actively punishing our most forward-thinking minds. The source material actually calls these individuals martyr scientists. Take 415 AD, for instance. The brilliant mathematician Hypatia was murdered in Alexandria, basically caught up in political and religious power struggles. Jump to 1553. Michael Servetus is burned at the stake in Geneva for challenging religious orthodoxy. In 1600, Giordano Bruno was publicly burned alive in Rome simply because he suggested the universe was infinite. And of course, the classic example. In 1633, Galileo was forced under the very real threat of torture to recant his astronomical discoveries, spending the rest of his life under house arrest. The absolutely crucial takeaway here: these people weren't persecuted just because of their science. They were silenced because their ideas directly threatened the established political and theological power structures of their day.
And this history leaves a long, lingering shadow. The theoretical physicist Max Planck had a famous, if somewhat grim, observation about this. He said, "A new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents, but rather because its opponents eventually die." It's tough to hear, but it's often summarized as, "Science progresses one funeral at a time." It really shows us that even in the realm of modern rational science, deeply entrenched beliefs almost always outlive logic and evidence.
Moving right along to Section 2, the Semmelweis Reflex, or the psychology of denial.
Okay, so thankfully we aren't burning people at the stake anymore, but how is this exact same rejection playing out in our own minds today? To get that, we need to talk about the Semmelweis Reflex. This is our reflex-like tendency to just instantly reject new evidence simply because it contradicts our established norms. The name comes from Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis. Back in 1847, he figured out that maternal mortality rates absolutely plummeted if doctors just did one simple thing: wash their hands with a chlorine solution before delivering babies. He literally had the empirical data to prove it. But his colleagues completely mocked him. Why? Well, the leading doctors at the time sincerely believed diseases spread through bad air. But even more amazingly, they were personally offended. They argued that because doctors were gentlemen, a gentleman's hands are inherently clean. They actively rejected life-saving evidence just to protect their own egos and the established paradigm.
So, what is actually driving this reflex in our brains? Well, it's a super powerful cocktail of cognitive biases. You've got confirmation bias, where we only pay attention to stuff that matches what we already believe. Authority bias, where we just blindly trust the senior person at the top over the brilliant junior assistant at the bottom. Then there's belief perseverance. This is actually a coping mechanism where our brains actively resist the discomfort of changing our minds, just to keep the status quo intact. Throw in groupthink, where keeping the group happy completely overrides alternative ideas. And finally, theory-induced blindness. This is a term popularized by Daniel Kahneman, meaning once you accept a theory, your brain uses it as its default lens, making it incredibly difficult to even see its flaws.
And please, do not think for a second this is just dusty 19th century history. Sigmund Freud's early theories, totally rejected by the Viennese Medical College. Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, heavily vilified by the German physics establishment at first. When Jane Goodall started her incredibly groundbreaking primate research, colleagues viciously criticized her. And you want to know why? Because she gave her chimpanzees personal names instead of assigning them numbers. I know, it sounds absurd now, but the pushback was very real. Even recently, the World Health Organization significantly delayed recognizing the airborne transmission of COVID-19 because they were clinging to the established norms about droplet transmission. Integrating truly innovative perspectives into existing frameworks is just a massive, massive hurdle for human psychology.
Which brings us to Section 3, Tall Poppy Syndrome, Cutting Down the Best. Now let's zoom out a bit, going from individual psychology to broader group culture. You might have actually heard the term tall poppy syndrome before, especially if you happen to be from Australia or New Zealand. It's a cultural phenomenon where people who achieve notable public success are heavily scrutinized, heavily criticized, or just straight up ostracized. The phrase actually goes way back to the Roman historian Livy. There's a story where the tyrannical Roman king Tarquin was asked by a messenger how his son should control a newly conquered city. Tarquin didn't even say a word. He just walked into his garden and started swinging a stick, taking the heads off all the tallest poppies. The underlying message was pretty undeniable: eliminate the most standout, eminent people.
And this highlights a really fascinating tension in modern culture. On the one hand, we absolutely value egalitarianism, right? We want fairness and equal opportunity for everybody. But sometimes that mutates into a straight-up aversion to success. Our sources point to studies showing how this toxic criticism actively hurts entrepreneurship, it restricts risk-taking, and it slows down overall economic growth. When a culture actively resents and punishes its high achievers just to keep everyone quote-unquote level, innovation literally dies.
Okay, Section 4, Institutional Gatekeeping, Silos and Suppression.
So we've covered the individual biases and the cultural resentment. But how do massive, sprawling organizations actually block innovation? Well, it happens step by step. First, these organizations build highly rigid vertical structures, often called silos. In public administration, they sometimes call them stovepipes, and honestly, that's the perfect metaphor. In a stovepipe, the fire burns really hot at the bottom. That's where the ground-level employees are. But the smoke, it only rises up. It never comes back down. Second step, managers start acting as gatekeepers, making personal calls to suppress information from moving up or down the chain. Third, senior leaders surround themselves in these tight, exclusive bubbles of yes people. And fourth, the whole structure ends up protecting the status quo, totally ignoring the actual evidence. It guarantees that new ideas are judged strictly by who is making the pitch rather than how good the idea actually is.
This leads us right into a really fascinating concept from the source material, the peer review paradox. Now, in science, peer review is supposed to be the ultimate gold standard for quality control, but in reality, it often acts as a massive, rigid gatekeeper. Because the reviewers are heavily trained in established theories, they just naturally resist any alternatives that contradict what they already know. The entire system creates a built-in bias against paradigm-shifting discoveries. It essentially sets up this self-perpetuating cycle where the academic hierarchy gets protected and truly disruptive, game-changing innovation gets locked out.
Let's hit Section 5, Societies in Decline and Ignoring the Cassandras.
So what happens when an entire society just stops listening to its forward thinkers? The author Anais Nin absolutely nailed this. She wrote, "Societies in decline have no use for visionaries." It is such a powerful statement, and it really underscores the deeply symbiotic relationship between how vital a society is and how willing it is to actually embrace the new.
When a society starts sliding downhill, whether we're talking economically, culturally, politically, the symptoms are glaring and the stakes are just incredibly high. First, you see extreme risk aversion. People get anxious, so they cling desperately to traditional beliefs and old institutions just for the comfort of it. All the attention shifts to slapping on short-term fixes instead of actually dealing with the underlying systemic rot. Societal cohesion starts to erode, and dissenting voices get pushed to the margins. The tragic part, the exact people trying to chart a new, better course are suddenly viewed as troublemakers or dangerous threats to a very fragile stability.
The sources call this dynamic the Cassandra complex. If you remember your Greek mythology, Cassandra was a priestess who was cursed to always speak true prophecies but never, ever be believed. Today, we routinely silence the people warning us about systemic flaws, just writing them off as pessimistic doomsayers. But here is the crucial takeaway from systems theory. Collapse and instability are actually perfectly normal, and they're essential for long-term evolutionary growth. When we force this toxic positive, don't worry, be happy attitude and artificially prop up a broken system, we're basically denying the natural cycle of creative destruction. We take what should be a healthy evolution and turn it into a catastrophic collapse.
Finally, Section 6,
Breaking the cycle. Nurturing the nonconformists.
So the million-dollar question, how do we actually fix this? Well, it starts with recognizing exactly who we're putting in charge. Our sources draw a really sharp line between conformist gatekeepers and visionary nonconformists. Gatekeepers tend to operate from this weird sense of superiority. They are orthodox, they are highly biased, and they fiercely resist change. But then you have the nonconformists. These are the folks who prioritize actual sense-making over blindly following the rules. They lean on unconventional thinking to create real progress. But above all else, they have the absolute courage to speak out and stick to their principles, no matter how hard the group pushes back.
I really want to leave you with a question to chew on today. Take a hard look around your workplace, your community, your specific industry. Are you actively nurturing the visionaries and the nonconformists? Or, maybe without even realizing it, are you acting as a gatekeeper? Are you letting that Semmelweis reflex kick in to protect a comfortable status quo? Ultimately, the survival and the progress of our institutions depends entirely on how we answer that exact